Yeah, I've been watching a lot of stuff lately. I checked out the new Adam Curtis documentary series called Shifty. And this is another one of these where he uses old news footage and interviews and loosely interweaves them into a coherent story. No voiceover like in something like hyper-normalization, just the text captions at the bottom of the screen, like he did in that Trauma Zone series about the collapse of the Soviet Union. To me, this is like an extension or even remix of the Mayfair State and maybe one other documentary that he's done. Obviously, the same sort of themes that are found in basically everything else that he's come out with is found here. This one is specifically about living in Britain in the late 20th century, basically the Thatcher rise to power in 1979 to the end of the century. That's the time period that we're covering. So the IMDb description says, quote, "When power begins to shift in society, everything becomes unstable, exciting, and frightening." It's hard to even explain what it's about at times, even though that sentence sums it up basically, because like a lot of Adam Curtis's stuff, it's not really a straight story. It's more like he's grabbing hundreds of different threads from different decades and weaving them into this narrative that's like moody. And this one is a haunting mood, a feeling that something fundamental has changed, but nobody in the country can name it. So one of the massive changes in society that he explores is monetarism, that theory and its implementation by Thatcher. So they're using money as the rational basis for the system to run on. And how this was the catalyst for really unleashing the power of finance and gradually stripping the power away from politicians and the government as a whole to enact or even enforce whatever policies or laws that they would have in the past to counteract these market forces that are taking over. So they implement these policies and almost immediately interest rates go up, factories close down around the country, and unemployment shoots up too. But Thatcher's determined. She sticks with the plan, despite the fact that nothing seems to be working in the way they thought it would. So power in this series is big, and the individual has no power. And even government advisors in their role don't have any real weight behind them in the face of that new power. So in this documentary, power is shifting from politicians and the centralized power of the state through money, which then liberates itself. But people as individuals who are like having to deal with all this, their sense of themselves is also shifting. So democracy gets eroded and you can't really stand up against power on your own. So as a result, you become atomized, you turn inward. And I think it's the second episode where he starts with this idea of distrusting. Suspicion is everywhere. Governments, people, even your own memory, or anything that we called a collective memory or narrative, national narrative. And he even brings in the rise of remix culture in music. So sampling and re-editing the past. And even that, on that level, how that subtly messes with our sense of what's real. Like if you can cut and paste anything, what is then authentic after that? What is your history? And what's just a stylized, reworked echo of the past? And throughout this episode, paranoia is bleeding into everything. So this is where he's showing the rise of surveillance and data collection and people being tracked or categorized or stored in a database somewhere. But it's not just like government's doing anymore. This is how he shows how it becomes later on, after this time period, in our own time period, it becomes getting tracked through apps and companies and tech giants and their algorithms, and how we start to internalize all that. We become our own observers. We post, we try to get likes and watch ourselves being watched. And this feedback loop that just changes how you exist, how you relate with the world. Adam Curtis is exploring all this, how this started last century. For example, he shows this one news report where people in the 1980s are being shown information about themselves that exist on a computer network. So credit reports and some personal information and they can't believe that this exists. That's shocking to them. So we get to episode 3, and there's a further deregulation of financial markets. And this one shows how they introduce privatized mortgages, more privatized mortgages, which helps to spur a real estate boom, even as the older industrialized economy is dying. It's being hollowed out. So you have entire swaths of the population that are being left behind. Meanwhile, GDP number go up. And some people within the system are becoming very wealthy, and they start turning old abandoned factories into luxury apartments to help spur the real estate boom. Then he shows that the intellectuals and members of the upper crust aren't really liking Thatcher and really don't like that the people she represents have turned their backs on the liberal elite, so to speak. So the lower middle class, and there's this divide between them and the upper crust, the liberal class. And those people are turning away from politics and moving their attention towards culture and art. And these elites, intellectual and otherwise, have a growing contempt for the working class and just go further into their own niche interests. And that's just a further aspect of the theme of losing control and people turning inward, as the outside world seems like it's just doing whatever, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's no recourse against it. And there's this growth of individualism and the focus on your individual body and your individual feelings. That's a common theme in history, at least according to some people's theories. For instance, the philosophy of Stoicism took root during that period of Rome because it's an attempt to control yourself in a world that's degrading. The empire is becoming harder to manage. The republic is dead, and you can't seem to get back on track with how things used to be or how you perceive things used to be. And other people in society are partaking in a self-absorbed gluttony. So you are pulling it back into an interior calm and control. And I guess we can extend that to today with this Stoic revival and use of meditation apps and the like as a way to turn away from our own insane society and culture. But getting back to the narrative of Shifty, Thatcher's advisors fear that she's unleashed finance as an abstract, and the collapse of British industry was in the interest of this new financial system. So that takes out the working class people, the middle class. But the rights and privileges of the aristocracy at the same time, they weren't privatized. So they're exempt from this, and they can still make money off their privileges of the past. And then we get to the late 1980s. We have the 1987 Black Monday stock crash. In 1992, we have Soros breaking the Bank of England, the pound collapse. And Britain has lost control of its economy to international finance. And then we have another thread where there's Stephen Hawking and his theories about the universe being less stable or coherent, or there's being time outside of the human perception of time, where there's no beginning or end to anything. And even his own wife in here is saying that his hyper-rationalist worldview was dangerous and was leading people into a limited view of the world, a very strange, different outlook for life. And from here, Curtis shifts into a whole section about the 80s and 90s in Britain. So we have Thatcher, further deregulation, privatizing previously owned public companies like water, and then the mortgage privatization in housing. The dream of owning a home becomes this symbol of success, safety, a way to have identity. But then even that collapses and people fall into debt and they have negative equity. And what used to be a path to feeling like you belong turns into a trap. But again, the aristocracy, the elites don't have to play that game. Their land, their privilege, their overall power is totally untouched. The rules change for everybody else but them. So everything that was once collective or more collective, like jobs, housing, even water, becomes atomized, becomes privatized. And at the same time, people start pulling away from politics. The intellectuals and the left-leaning types don't trust Thatcher. And they don't organize. They turn to culture, so art, theory, aesthetics, and they're just retreating into style while everything outside keeps hollowing out. I listened to Adam Curtis in an interview on this, Or he basically says that everything we're seeing now is theater. Like, no one knows really what's going on, but we act like we do. Politics, social media, the cycle of outrage, it's all pantomime. It's noise. And when reality feels that unstable, people are looking for other ways to feel grounded. He talks about this Ozzy Osbourne clip or quote where people are having to get fucked up and what that says about society. To me, I was like, what? Like, addiction to getting fucked up or just to cope with life is a problem, sure. But most people who have used alcohol or drugs don't have an addiction whatsoever. They might have addictions to other things, or at least bad habits. And most of what else they get into, like junk food, porn, or whatever, they're bad habits that have just become so entrenched in their lives. They're not necessarily addictions for all those people. They're not great, but on the drugs and alcohol front, ancients, tribes around the world have been getting fucked up in their religious ceremonies forever. It's something we like doing as humans. We like edge running our consciousness and expanding or contracting our perceptions. It's actually fun sometimes, enlightening to your life in some way. The Eleusinian mysteries were probably pretty dope. The ancient Egyptians used alcohol. Others used ecstatic dancing, chanting, and whatever else to shift their reality. That is some real shifty shit. The difference now is we do it alone, privately, with no ritual, no framing, no deeper context, and it's more prevalent. I mean, you don't think a person 3,000 years ago, if they had unlimited access to alcohol and drugs like we do, they wouldn't go for the same thing. It wouldn't have anything to do with feeling like everything's unstable or everything's chaotic. People were doing drugs in the 19th century. It was a lot more slow and stable back then. Now, you could argue the reason why, but a lot of the times it's just people like getting fucked up. But he also posits that in this interview that maybe mass democracy was a temporary phenomena spurred on by mass industrialization and that it's ultimately run its course. And we're now hyper-individuals who are connected, but we still feel alone and powerless. Which kind of sums up the whole vibe of the series. The frames that once bound us have fallen away. We used to get meaning from myth, shared symbols, ritual. Now it comes from whatever's trending, I guess. whatever you see on your phone or nowhere at all. There is no meaning. But there's also the bigger thing that's going on that Adam Curtis is pointing to, how money became this runaway force. At some point, politicians were no longer willing or able to steer the ship. That power migrated into finance, into code, into global money flows. And we're just kind of floating in the sea, pretending we have control while watching the old structures that seem to make sense to us collapse around us. So in response to that, what do? We focus on ourselves. We do things like track our sleep. We log our feelings. We go to therapy. We read self-help books, trying to heal your fucking inner child. And sure, I guess some of that's good, maybe. But it's also lonely and not satisfying. Like, we're all trying to do maintenance on our own little islands while everything's sinking. Or at least that's what I think he's getting at here. And by the end of the series, what's really sticking with me isn't one factor, policy. It's his moody atmosphere, the sense that we're living in a world where everything used to seem to have meaning. Our work, our home life, identity, our family. But that's all been rebranded and sold back to us. And all those things have been hollowed out, emptied out. They're still there, but they're just empty. They have no real core or meaning in the same way. But for me, under all that, under the confusion and the simulation and coping that people are doing, I think there's something sacred trying to break through. And that's what I've been coming back to this entire podcast series, in between the dick jokes and everything. Like, Curtis isn't in this documentary offering a real hope. It's trying to name it, trying to offer this space of clarity, seeing what's going on behind the spectacle, all the narrative and everything like that, and how it took form. So maybe that's a starting point for what he's trying to accomplish, not fixing everything overnight, but seeing clearly, naming the illusions, and slowly remembering how everything's supposed to work, how to have something real, tell real stories, so that narratives don't just collapse under their own weight, that there's actually something to move us forward. If you buy his entire narrative, which I don't know that I necessarily do, all of it. But that's where I was at with Shifty, what I was thinking about